If you find yourself repeatedly struggling with toxicity in romantic relationships, like walking on eggshells around a partner to avoid confrontation, consistently prioritizing their needs to the detriment of your own, or losing your self esteem when they're not with you, you might have been dubbed codependent in your past. This may leave you wondering, what is codependency and what do attachment styles have to do with it? Well, today I'm sharing a clip of a live stream event for my online students in which I address the radical truth about codependency, including 5 signs of what is traditionally considered a codependent relationship, and 2 case studies of how codependency is actually an expression of underlying insecure attachment styles. Now, spoiler alert, it is not just anxious open hearts who fall into the codependent category. Now, by the end of this segment, you will be able to stop beating yourself up for falling into toxic relationships with emotionally unavailable partners and/or partners that are too demanding and invasive. More than that, you'll have discovered why attachment styles are the single most influential factor affecting your relationships, even if you are codependent. Believe me, this replay is going to be totally worth your time and you are going to gain so much clarity. Make sure you save it so that you can come back to it and listen to it again. Now, if you are new to my channel, welcome. My name is Briana MacWilliam, and I am a licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist with more than 15 years in the field, helping adults struggling with insecure attachment go from self-doubting to self-sovereign so they can attract the soul-shaking, passionate partnerships that they want. And I do this using a psycho-spiritual approach to creative arts interventions, which I call the MacWilliam method. The content on my YouTube channel is derived from my online courses, which you can learn more about through the link in the caption of this video. If you would like to learn more about your attachment style, you can take the 4-question quiz. If you like what you see and hear and you want to learn more, make sure you like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. I put out videos once a week, and I wouldn't want you to miss out. All right, so let's dive into our topic for today. What is codependency? Well, a codependent relationship is a kind of dysfunctional relationship in which one person assumes the role of caretaker or rescuer, and the other person tends to assume a role of the dependent or the rescued. And so the caretaker assumes a habit of thought and behavior that consistently prioritizes the well-being and the happiness of their partner above their own. And this is to the point where they lose their sense of value and their sense of purpose without that person. And so as the more functionally capable partner, however, the caretaker tends to enable their partner's dependent and sometimes self-sabotaging behavior. And that often includes things like addictive habits, for example. So the caretaker, more often than not, was usually a parentified child in a dysfunctional childhood home. And they had a tendency to kind of smooth things over to avoid conflict or upset. Now, the dependent partner often has significant feelings of low self-esteem, fears of failure, self-doubt, guilt, and shame. And this partner is the child that absorbed the dysfunction in their childhood home and tends to recreate that in their adult life. Now, codependent relationships are also illustrated by a preoccupation with being physically and emotionally close to someone that you consider to be essential to getting your survival needs met, and so that your sense of identity and your self-worth is preserved, whether you are the rescuer or the rescuee, the dominator or the victim, okay? So I want to go over 5 signs of a codependent relationship. Now, there are many signs of a codependent relationship, but I'm just going to outline 5 of the major ones. So number 1 is people pleasing. Now, it's normal to want to be liked and to want your loved ones to be happy, but people pleasing becomes detrimental when you feel like you have no choice in the matter and you have an inability to say no. And that significantly impacts you, especially when it interferes with getting what you need or even knowing what you need. Now, the caretaker in a codependent dynamic may be the particularly guilty party of this, but the dependent partner also can fall prey to this as well. Now, another sign is a lack of boundaries. So people in both roles, both the caretaker and the dependent in a codependent relationship, tend to have problems recognizing, respecting, and reinforcing boundaries, their own and that of their partners. So having boundaries simply means that you respect the other person's right to their own feelings and to their autonomy. And you acknowledge that their reality and their perspective and their experience could be different than yours, and yet it's equally as valid and as important as yours. You also realize that these two different realities and experiences, they can exist harmoniously in a love relationship where it is safe to honestly communicate and negotiate your needs. It also means recognizing that while you would like to contribute to your partner's happiness, you're not entirely responsible for it. Now, people in codependent relationships fail to recognize boundaries. They either have too loose boundaries, or they choose not to honor their own boundaries. They choose not to respect a partner's boundaries, or they have boundaries that are too rigid and thus they are fragile. So in the extreme, instances of manipulation, over control, ambivalence, and confusion, as well as abuse and victimization, can be the result of a lack of boundaries, particularly in codependent, or what we might even call toxic relationships. Okay. Now, another sign is poor self-esteem. Typically, neither person in a codependent relationship has very good self-esteem. One person needs the approval of the other, or at least needs to be in service of the other to have a sense of goodness about themselves. The caretaker tends to communicate the message, I need you to need me in order to affirm my specialness. Okay. And can control their partner sometimes through shame and what is called the martyred syndrome, what I call the martyred syndrome. So look at all I do for you, and what have you done for me lately? Now, the dependent partner has low self-esteem and is very sensitive to criticism and guilt trips as a result of depending on the validation from their partner that they have a right to their thoughts and their feelings and their needs. So the dependent partner then learns to kind of wield their power through victimization, which is a way of persuading others to have sympathy for them and to act on their behalf. And this is while avoiding taking on too much responsibility for affirming and validating themselves and their own experience. Now, another sign is reactivity. Now, for the caretaker, when your identity is based on pleasing others and you feel responsible for everybody's well-being, you might find yourself reacting to situations rather than acting out of your own volition. So you're reacting rather than acting. And you might find yourself becoming defensive or easily internalizing someone else's criticism. This is a result in part of having lost touch with your own wants and needs and desires, and that makes it really hard to be proactive and to access a sense of purpose from your own inner firelight, rather than depending upon somebody else's. It's also partly a result of your inability to establish boundaries so that you feel responsible for someone else's feelings all the time. For the dependent partner, they're too sensitive to criticism and shame as well, and they distrust their own value and worth, and they often question who they even are, fundamentally speaking. And so as a result, they can take things way too personally, and they have a disproportionately defensive response to even the most benign and slightest of requests. Any expression of displeasure or a constructive comment will not be taken well. And this defensive response might look like a total denial of accountability and self-aggrandizement, or becoming deeply depressed and sinking into the identity of the totally hapless victim. Now, we also have poor communication. A codependent mindset makes it really hard to communicate effectively. The caregiver is often unaware of their own wants and needs, and when they are aware of them, they may be reluctant to express them because they don't want to appear too burdensome or revealing of whatever their suppressed neediness might be. They may feel like caring for the other person is the most important thing, or they might fear upsetting the other person if they assert themselves. Now, the dependent partner may be in the habit of communicating dishonestly, more interested in maintaining safety and connection through things like manipulation and control than actually communicating from an emotionally honest place. So learning how to communicate honestly and authentically and effectively, however, is really crucial to breaking these unhealthy patterns in relationships and determining once and for all if the two parties are in fact compatible beneath all of the defensive posturing. Okay. So now that we've gone over these 5 signs, I'd love for you to just let me know in the comments there if any of these sound familiar or if you relate to them. And then I'd like to take a closer look at how the roles of caretaker and dependent play out and demonstrate how attachment styles may be the underlying culprit in these dynamics through a couple of case studies. So let's take a closer look at the caretaker using a case study. Now, Mary is a cisgender lesbian woman with a big heart who takes pride in her profession as a nurse. Mary identifies with the caretaking rescuer role in codependent relationships because when she finds herself attracted to someone, she has a habit of prioritizing their needs above her own. Now, Mary believes she has to earn love and approval, and so she feels drawn to partners that are challenging or edgy, who really make her work for it. Now, on the other hand, if Mary met a partner that gave her love and affection too freely, she tends to find them too boring or too nice and questions the truth of their affection because they didn't seem to really need her and or she didn't have to work hard enough to earn that. So she has a tendency to think, if they need me, they won't leave me. And so historically, her partners would tend to take her for granted while refusing to commit to her long term, but also refusing to let the relationship end. Now, Mary would then blame herself for not loving her partner well enough to inspire them to want to love her better. But in truth, Mary actually went through great pains to withhold her uncomfortable emotions and deepest desires from them during the relationship so as not to burden her partners with her problems, thinking that this would ultimately keep them around. And so Mary felt if she took on all the responsibility for what went wrong in the relationship, then it must be within her power to fix it. But this fix-it attitude left her with this really harsh inner critic, and she often came across as kind of aloof or judgmental to her more sensitive and emotionally volatile partners. So while Mary adored her lovers for vicariously expressing all the painful feelings that Mary would not allow herself to feel and believed that she was holding space for them to do that, they often wound up accusing her of being emotionally unavailable and expressed feeling alone in the relationship with her. Inevitably, they would leave her, which wound up proving Mary's deepest fear, which was that she was unlovable and she was unworthy, that she hadn't performed well enough, and that somehow she was too much while at the same time not enough and had failed in her relationship. Now let's take a look at the role of the dependent. Now, if you tend to slip into wanting to be rescued in your relationships, but then feeling kind of resentful, irritated, trapped, or desperately dependent upon and beholden to your savior of a partner, once they do rescue you, you might relate to the dependent role in a codependent dynamic. And in this case, I'm going to tell you about John. Now, John is a cisgender heterosexual man who recognizes the dependent pattern in his current relationship with his partner, whom I'm going to call Jenny. And she is a cisgender heterosexual woman. Now, when prompted, John usually has no issue speaking his mind, but sometimes he can come across as angry or abrasive or overly emotional in his delivery. In the beginning of the relationship, Jenny adopted a habit of inserting herself into the conversation and glossing over his words, restating them in a more palatable way and or sometimes even apologizing for John's manner. Now, on the one hand, in the moment, this made John feel ashamed and condescended to. But on the other hand, he started getting more social invitations and holiday cards. And so over time, John became convinced that Jenny must just have better judgment than he does, as well as the gift of gab. And so he became quieter and quieter and quieter in the relationship, silently acquiescing to Jenny's way of doing things. Now, John also had a tendency to procrastinate, but sometimes he needs that fire under his ass to get things done because pressure tended to motivate him. But that stress upsets Jenny, who tends to make his problems her problems, and now John feels guilty for stressing Jenny out too, which makes him needy of her reassurances that she still loves him anyway. Then John starts to feel angry for being so needy and resents Jenny for trying to fix everything for him. He starts to feel an impulse to fail just to spite her and to get her off his case. Why even bother if she's just going to swoop in and do everything all over for him again anyway? And this reminds him of his childhood when every time he tried to do something for himself, someone else would redo it or show him the correct way, which was always better than his way. Now, still, John has become dependent on Jenny to do this because deep down, he doesn't trust his ability to succeed on his own. And so, lastly, like his father, John tends to struggle with anxiety in social situations and he drinks too much to compensate. So then, when he inevitably embarrasses himself once again, Jenny swoops in and saves the day, getting him home safely. And while John is glad to see her, in fact, he was the one who called on her for a ride. On another level, it just proves to him that he's not capable of taking care of himself and doesn't truly deserve his partner either. So this creates tremendous doubt and ambivalence within him, which bleeds into his rather loud and frequent arguments with Jenny, who is very confused by his mixed signals. After all, isn't he the one asking for help, but then bites her head off when she accommodates him? So from Jenny's perspective, it is as if no good deed goes unpunished with John. Now, in the end, John often winds up looking and feeling like the bad guy. Now, if this sounds familiar, you may want to pay attention here because I'm going to suggest something a bit radical. And that is, what if beneath these roles of a codependent dynamic, Mary and John are actually struggling with a symptom of insecure attachment styles? And they have simply attracted romantic partners that have insecure attachment as well. Now that we've gone over some case examples of a codependent dynamic, do you recognize any of these patterns in your relationship? Would you say that you identify with the caretaking role or the codependent role? Do you recognize any of these roles in your family of origin or in your partners? I would love for you to give me a like or a comment or just type a little note there with your experience below the video so that I know that I'm on the right track with this and we can create more content like it. Now, while caretakers or rescuers are often associated with anxiously attached open hearts, the truth is avoidantly attached Rolling Stones can inhabit the caretaking role as well. Anxious rescuers and caretakers, they can often take on too much responsibility, sacrificing themselves for their partner's benefit. You may act unfailingly loving and compassionate, almost to the point of saintly, while repressing anger, hurt, or resentment. So good deeds earn admiration and approval while affirming your rightness and your specialness, your worthiness, and sometimes your moral superiority. But for the anxious folks, the endless performance often leads to feeling depressed and more anxious, as well as, ironically, a deeper feeling of being unseen and unacknowledged, right? Avoidant rescuers or caretakers keep themselves emotionally separate and coolly disconnected in order to keep things running smoothly. They may struggle to be emotionally present in a healthy situation, but have learned to function well in crisis situations. Therefore, they may gravitate towards those who are more likely to need their calm and collected orderliness, namely people who are perpetually in crisis. So for the avoidant caretaker, it's easy to prioritize fixing a partner over emotionally bonding to them. There are many people who will commit their time, energy, and resources and even marry a lifelong partner, but still withhold emotional intimacy for fear of being too vulnerable and weak, and or because they were just never taught an emotional vocabulary and they have been conditioned to be emotionally dismissive their entire lives. Mary's situation is a really good example of this. So these are partners that are often they're unwilling to admit that they are unhappy if they are aware that they are unhappy. And they tend to struggle with actively doing anything to change the fact, right? Yet they will fight tooth and nail to avoid ending a relationship or getting a divorce. They tend to get angry when their partner wants to change the status quo or deepen the emotional intimacy between them because they would rather not rock the boat. Now, in these situations, we see the attachment system has become activated with survival concerns and maintaining the physical and emotional proximity in the relationship, even if the relationship has become a cold and distant one. So in other words, keeping their partners not too close, but not too far away either, is just right where it is safe and comfortable for them. But regarding the dependent partner, now, in John's case, he illustrates fearful avoidance, or what is sometimes called disorganized attachment. I call these folks spice of lifers. So on the one hand, he anxiously asks for Jenny to save him, wanting to be emotionally close to her and to experience a sense of validation in her responsiveness to him. But then he resents her when she shows up, on the white horse, because it means that once again, he failed to do it for himself, proving that he's helpless and powerless after all. And so John cannot love Jenny without constantly holding himself in comparison to her and finding himself lacking. He also hates how much he needs her because from his perspective, she will always have more power over him than he has over her. And he feels like he just disappears when she's around. And so the frustrating thing is that with this knowledge, if Jenny were to try to help make things better or easier for John, it only exacerbates the issue and it enables him even more. In either case, however, you might notice that the attraction could fade if either a caretaker or a dependent partner becomes increasingly self-possessed. And that is because they are outgrowing that similar wound that functioned as a point of attraction between them in the first place. Do you recognize yourself in any of the 5 codependent signs? Does Mary or John's story relate to you? What role do you think you play in a codependent dynamic? Let me know in the comments below. Now, if you can relate to any of this content, it can be a very difficult cycle to get out of. And that's because insecure lovers of every style often conflate their own confused, angry, yearning, and suffering feelings for their partners with true and predestined love. And so they remain in unhealthy, toxic patterns and relationships, hoping that one day its potential will pay off. And it is also true that you can move beyond defensive attachment triggers to discover that you are in fact compatible with your partner, but you won't know the real chance it has unless you familiarize yourself with attachment styles and how they may be unconsciously motivating your perceptions, feelings, and behaviors in your relationship. Once you realize the power that attachment styles have over your every waking thought, feeling, and behavior, it's like a splinter in your mind, and you just have to know what attachment style you have. So you can start to break all of those destructive codependent relationship habits and start experiencing the kind of fulfilling relationship that you have always dreamed of. And I know that because that is what happened to me. That's also why I have developed my attachment styles quiz. With just 4 laser-focused questions, I can tell you what attachment style you have and what that means for you moving forward in your relationship. So if you want to learn more about which attachment style you have, you can click that link in the caption of this video. After taking the quiz, you will receive a written and recorded explanation for the strengths, struggles, and challenges for someone with your attachment style, and also how it's likely to be affecting you in your relationship. Now, if you'd like to learn more about the basics of attachment in general, I invite you to check out my video, Attachment Basics. Lastly, recognizing that you may have stumbled into a toxic pattern of relating is really the first step to acknowledging the influence that attachment styles may have on you. If you'd like to learn more about how to recognize a toxic relationship and what healthy boundaries and behaviors you should be encouraging instead, stay tuned for my next video, in which we will further discuss attachment styles in relationships, including 6 tips for healing toxic relationships. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.